the mood around defense tech has already shifted. Defense funding inside European deep tech grew 125% last year to $1.8 billion. One quick session after this, and then we will have a break. So I will move on now. Our next speaker has done something most of corporate Europe still hasn't figured out. He's backed 7 unicorns. Daniel DePaul is the founder of Evor, and over the last decade, he has built a track record almost no one in this room can match. His question today is simple but uncomfortable. Why does corporate Europe keep losing its best innovators? Please welcome Daniel DePaul.
All right, good to see you all. I am talking today about something that is rather untypical for me. I'm going to talk about startup corporate collaboration. And I'm going to do this from my very own biased perspective. I'm going to share the startup founder perspective today. I'm a founder since I'm 19. Since I can think, I'm building companies, and I really want to share the perspective of myself as a founder, of the founders I've invested in, and the collaboration they've had with big companies, and what works and what doesn't. And I also want to share the insights of why the best founders I've backed all moved to the United States. Out of the 7 unicorns I have backed as an angel, many of them were in Europe at the time I invested. By now, most of them, all of them actually, all of them are out of Europe. 6 of them are in the US, and 1 of them is in Singapore, right? So there is something going on here in Europe that prevents us from keeping the best people and having the best startup founders stay. And I want to start with a quick introduction of what I typically do. So I built this fellowship together with a fantastic team that I'm going to show in a second that supports people who think in decades and build in days. We mean this literally. We are looking for people who build generational companies. Hopefully companies that make it way longer than a typical VC life cycle. We're looking for people who build companies that will last 30, 40, 50 years even, which is also why we love to invest in young founders. This is the team. 40% of us have built a company between 100 million and 10 billion. And we dedicate our lives to help people succeed with their startups and build these generational companies. And part of that is early traction and collaboration with big corporations that I will go into in a second. The stats are as follows. Within the last half year, 25% of the Evor fellows raised on a 9-figure valuation, so they are building companies at exceptional speed. To name one example, we had one fellow in January who was building a fully autonomous doctor. It was just the founder in January. In February, raised a 10 million seed round. In March, onboarded their first 10,000 paying users, and now closing a 50 million Series A on a 250 million valuation. Right? So we are looking for people who move exceptionally fast and support them. The average, the median raise, which is lower than the average raise, is around $5 million. And we take 30 founders a year that we support. So that is roughly 3 per Evor partner. And I want to start with a bit of a meta story of why I believe collaborating with startups is so incredibly important if you're a corporate. And as a founder, why it is so important to get early sales to big corporations. Well, first of all, unicorns are quite normal today. We used to have 4 unicorns a year around a decade ago. So seeing a company go from 0 to a billion was a crazy thing. It's not anymore. Right now, we have roughly 1 unicorn a day globally. That's the pace. On top of this, we see companies die faster and faster. This is an excerpt out of the S&P 500. And we're looking at the average time that companies spent in there. So for how long were they a top 500 American company, right? It used to be 61 years, around 60 years ago. Then it went down to 25 years in 1980. Now it's around 15 years, and it's soon going to go below 10 years. And the reason for that is speed of change. We are seeing that things are changing faster and faster and faster. The Industrial Revolution happened over 3 generations, which gave companies plenty of time to adapt. The Digital Revolution happened within 1 generation. So people already lacked empathy, and reacting as a corporation became more difficult, which explains why we have this statistic here, right? And now the AI revolution is happening even faster, and we're seeing companies like Anthropic worth $1 trillion that are 5 years old. In fact, the biggest companies in the world are all in the US now, and funnily, 3 of them are basically still startups. They are around 30 years old. If you look into the top 10, you also have Meta and Tesla. These companies are 20 years old. And now you have companies like Anthropic or OpenAI that are also approaching $1 trillion in value, that are around less than 10 years old, right? And somehow in Europe, we lack the ability to build these kind of companies. And I believe it all starts with trying to sell in Europe. Personally, when I was 19, I tried to do my first sale. I was in front of Deutsche Bahn, and this is meant to be a crude sketch of me standing in front of those huge tower. And I was wildly nervous because this was my first ever sales meeting that I had in my life, and I was approaching a C-level executive there. And I showed up, opened the door, and the guy looked at me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Daniel. We discussed via email. You have a meeting today." And he just looks at me and says, "I'm not talking to a kid." And I said, "Well, I came here all the way from Switzerland. You know, it's like 8 hours train ride. I would be delighted if you have 10 minutes for me." He said, "I'm not talking to the fucking intern. Leave my meeting right now." I tried to convince him 2 more times, then it got really uncomfortable, and then I just left, and I went home back to Switzerland. And I remember back then that train ride was very expensive for me. I didn't care about the time, but I really cared about that train ride. Half a year later, I had mass mailed every investor that I could find in Switzerland to invest in my company. By the way, none of them invested. And I remember one phone call with someone saying, "Look, you have burned the ecosystem, you have talked to everyone, you have oversold, no one likes you here, just leave, right? You won't ever raise in Switzerland." And last week I got a call from a friend of mine in San Francisco, and he said, "Daniel, I met this 19-year-old kid. He's super cool, he's a little bit naive, but I'm putting in 100K just to support him, you know, to see what happens." And I sometimes wonder, why are we not doing this in Europe? If you look at the statistics, actually buyer behavior is exactly like this, right? We have 5.5 times more spent in the US per employee on startup software than we have in Europe. When we look at cost of experimentation, in Europe it's twice as expensive to experiment. Why? Because we need to spend so much more money on compliance. So GDPR and all these kind of things are holding us back in Europe to sell more. Sales cycles are, depending on the industry, up to 3 times longer here. So it takes people way longer to buy. Procurement is incredibly hard to penetrate. And this is important because every startup is in this cycle. They need more traction in order to get more funding, in order to get more traction with the money they raise, in order to get more funding, right? And by not being open to the best startups, we as an ecosystem in Europe are cutting off the strongest ones. So we are essentially responsible by not buying startup software for many people to leave to the US, sell in the US because it's faster, the contracts are bigger, and we're not giving people a chance. And therefore, out of all of the unicorns I backed, every single one of them left Europe. And I've been with a couple of them first check in, and I chat with the founders quite regularly, and it's always one of two things. It's either talent and work ethic, or it's sales. It's always one of the two in every single discussion I have. So I believe, knowing that there are a lot of corporate leaders here in the room, you are responsible for 50% of this flywheel equation, right? And by collaborating with startups, you are also extending your half-life. For anyone here who is building relationships with startups as part of their jobs, well, first of all, I recommend you provide access to C-level directly to shorten the sales cycle. There are a lot of studies that show that the more C-level is involved in discussions with startups, the more sales happen, right? So also companies in Europe that get their C-level more involved in startup procurement have longer half-life time. On top of this, incentivize exited founders, right, to join you and bring in the empathy. I sometimes don't understand how an entire department for startup collaboration has people that never built a startup in their life. I think there should be people who've never built a startup, 50%, but the other 50% should be exited successful founders who understand how a startup thinks, how they breathe, and bringing those people into the organization will be absolutely crucial. At the same time, I recommend to optimize for technology, not industry. What I see many corporates we talk to at Ivor in order to collaborate with startups say is, hey, this is not my industry, this is not a mobility startup. Well, the best innovations happen when you combine different perspectives and actually optimizing for crazy technology. For example, you are BMW and you're saying, well, computer vision is incredibly interesting for autonomous driving, or reinforcement learning is incredibly interesting. Well, try to bring in people who are building these technologies, who are working on computer vision, who are working on reinforcement learning, because those people will be the ones who help you build in your capabilities. And this is another really interesting statistic. When we look at companies that spend more time with people building disruptive technologies, they get less disrupted themselves, right? So the best way to not get disrupted is to let the disruptor into your spaces and collaborate with them. And lastly, I recommend you collaborate with a household brand. You do not need to reinvent the entire way of how accelerators or VCs work. They're already out there, they're working great. So go to the visionaries, the Creandums, the Sequoias of this world and ask them, who are your strongest companies? Which of the softwares should we buy? Which of them are ready? Because these people really do know what they're doing. And this is also something we started at Ivor. We've realized that a lot of companies do not buy startup software because these companies die. And then you've bought software of a company that is dead the next year, and your entire company, or at least some sort of department, is tied to that software. That's a problem, right? So collaborating with someone like Sequoia, where you know these companies will survive way longer, or someone like Ivor, where we can guarantee these companies raise at least $5 million. They will be around for at least the next 5 years. Then you can actually plan and expand into the startup ecosystem. So I would love to talk. I am here today because at Ivor we just launched a new initiative called the Global Innovator Circle, where we invite people, decision makers in big companies to join us and chat to our founders early. Any one of you can reach out to me. Thank you for listening, and I would love to talk, and I would absolutely love to bring more startup founders in Europe into big organizations and foster the collaboration between big companies and startups so that we stand a chance in Europe, and soon I can show a table in which the top 5 biggest companies aren't only from the US. Thank you very much. I was told we're doing a small Q&A because we've got around 10 minutes left. So I'm happy to talk about anything. It doesn't have to be startup corporate collaboration. We can talk about the fellowship, startup journey, investing, whatever is interesting. If any one of you has a question, you can raise your hand, and there are volunteers around that can give you a microphone, and then we can go around. Otherwise, I understand there are already a couple of questions, so we can also just do a moderated chat. I'm going to wait a minute or so to see if there's anything here in the room. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing. I've got one question. If you would be the president of a united Europe, what would be the one thing that you would change immediately?
That's a great question. I would focus on fostering a united Europe, essentially, right? I would try to bring us to not think as Germans, as French people, as Austrians, but to think as Europeans. Because we have more people in Europe than in the US. Part of the problem that prevents startups to scale in Europe is that the US has a homogeneous mass of 320 people, all being in one country, all having the same regulation, right? And that leads to them selling way faster. This is, by the way, why Uber started half a year later than My Taxi. They had way more people to scale to, and still overtook My Taxi and bought all of the other competitors because they had more growth. Because they had more growth, they got more funding. Because they had more funding, they could buy the European competitors. And this pattern happens all the time. So if I was president of United Europe, I would try to foster this collaboration within Europe so that we can act as one entity. I would push initiatives like the EU Inc., from Andy Klinger. I would push initiatives like down-regulating things for startups. A big problem in Europe is actually labor law. Labor law is preventing us from building companies worth between $1 billion and $100 billion. What is incredibly interesting is per dollar venture capital, Europe has just as many unicorns as the US. So that is not the problem, going from 0 to $1 billion. But afterwards, Europe becomes up to 15 times more expensive. And I think most of the people who work at startups and in crazy R&D initiatives, they don't even care about labor law. They don't even care about changing their jobs because they're so incredible, they're going to find a job easier anyway. So by down-regulating the smart parts, where really we have blockers in Europe to build these $100 billion companies, I believe we'd be way better off to scale from $1 billion to $100 billion and to react to external shocks, like the AI shock. Mark Zuckerberg can just throw out 30 people and react to the shock instantly. SAP can't do this. And sadly, this is a problem of growing faster, right? So I would down-regulate at the right points without destroying a system that is quite protective and great. And I would try to unify the regulatory landscape and the procurement landscape as much as I could. And I believe that already would make a big difference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. It was wonderful to hear your presentation. I would like to ask more about a lot is being talked about bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
And one of the problems that I see is not actually something that politicians would do, but bureaucratic machine itself. Especially for example, in Germany, bureaucratic machine is extremely strong. And I don't know. And since Europe is and Germany obviously is democracy, you can't. One person or group of politicians can't change that, right? So it's actually a very hard job, and you can't fire these people, and they are very strong, And from this perspective, that comes to obviously that's harming startups and businesses, right? And that harms also valuations of startups because of that as well, because there is also a mentality issue that That's why the valuations in Europe is, so it's all affecting, right? And maybe your opinion in that sense, how we can actually fight that, how can we make sure that actually it's something that we can work together on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have thought a lot about this because it is a big issue, right? Back in the day when we invented democracy, the world didn't change a lot, right? So we developed a system that worked really well and continued to work really well the way we structured it initially. Now, with technological change, things happen so fast. I was talking about these disruption charts, right, and how quick revolutions happen, that we need to react faster than the current democratic system allows us to do. I'm not saying democracy is a bad idea. I'm thinking this is the best system we've ever come up with, but I'm saying it's very slow. And if there's an autocratic leader in another nation, they can very quickly react to these changes, and currently we don't have an answer. And I also don't have an answer, but I know that somehow, as nations with the political systems we have, we need to get faster. I think one of this could be leadership. I believe we have very poor leadership in Europe, and I also believe that it is not cool anymore to go into politics. Most smart people, there's actually graphs that show where do the people with the highest IQ, with the best grades from the best universities. I don't know if that is truly smart, right? But let's use this as a proxy. Where do they go, right? And they used to go into politics. The best people used to go into politics. Then at one point, they saw all the banks have all the control. Then they went into banks. And then from banks, they went into consulting. And then from consulting, now they're going into startups. This is great for startups. This is really bad for politics. I don't know what the solution is, but I know somehow we need to figure out a way for smart, clever people, great leaders, to go back into politics and enact change. And I believe that many of the speed issues that I've described would be fixable should we be able to bring great people with great leadership back into politics. I believe things would happen much faster. And then on top of this, I believe we should just get used to the fact that the world we were born in is 100% different to the world we will die in, and start adjusting the system. Because so far we have invented stuff like pension, social insurance in Germany, like the pots are completely empty, and we know it doesn't work. We look at the data, and it was a great idea looking at the demographic curves back then. It's not a great idea anymore. We know this. We know the data. We know the problems. No one is doing anything about it, right? I think we need the trust to say, hey, this was a bad invention. Let us do something else that is a new response to the world, how it works today, and create the system accordingly. And so far, no one is doing this, and I hope someone would. Yeah? Otherwise, we will see the best people brain drain away. I have so many friends that created billion-dollar organizations, and they all left Germany as a tax residency because they don't believe in the future, which in the end is a leadership issue ultimately. I think we've got a last one over there.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks. I'm Ilan from ONU Energy here from Berlin. Quick question on corporate procurement. This morning on stage, there was Martin and Frank Appel talking about this voluntary 1% pledge. I think that sounds like a big lever. What do you think? How can we get European corporates to buy more from startups?
Yeah, I think this is a great idea, first of all. I think the more people we have that buy from startups, the more we will lift the tails, of the heavy tail distribution curves, the power law that is modeling economic change, right? So that is exactly the right idea, to get more procurement. I also think that if you make something voluntary, a lot of people won't do it, right? So in the best case, we create an incentive, we create success cases, we create data that shows that this is actually within the interest of the companies, right? And I believe Adam Smith's invisible hand is so beautiful because it's a system that just works based on the incentive mechanisms, right? And I think any company here in Europe should realize that they are better off collaborating with startups in the right way. The problem, in my opinion, is a problem of knowledge. They don't know, right? Most of the procurement departments I've talked to, and my previous company sold to banks, so it was up to like 28-month sales cycles. And they are not aware, like that shortening this is a big advantage. And secondly, the people within the system, they don't really care. They're just one cog in the system, right? And they don't really look at the global picture, right? So I believe it needs to be CEO stuff. So how do we get more procurement volume there? If the CEO says, we pledge, we do this, that's why I think it's a great idea, right? Like it needs to come from the top, and they need to say, we need to just spend X amount of money on startups, right? And then we need to define the right metrics to make it happen. On top of this, I believe that you can define goals for how long a sales cycle should be, right? You can define goals for how much should be spent on per startup, right? Like, do you do many? You can define goals of how the startups are meant to grow with the organization, right? And which metrics they should deliver. There's actually a lot of startups right now in the agentic AI space that save a lot of cost, and this is very measurable. The previous machine learning age didn't allow to do this. It was not mostly cost savings. It was different benefits. But now we can measure these cost savings, build a case study around it, show it to the other corporates, and they can say, oh, we can save 10 million doing this as well. Let's invite the startup that did it for this corporate, right? And thirdly, I believe we should share way more we should collaborate as a community with other corporate leaders. In the US, if someone passes and says, I don't want to buy your software, they do on average 10 times more introductions than in Europe. Just introducing you to other corporate leaders, saying something like, hey, this is really cool software, try this out, even if they don't buy. In Europe, barely anyone, at least 10 times less people are doing this, right? So by fostering community, by having these kind of events, by having those people meet each other and say, hey, this is a really cool startup, this might appeal to my 5 friends that I've met at Deep Tech Momentum, that would make a massive difference.
Thank you so much, Daniel Tippold. Yeah. And with that,
Pleasure.
7 unicorn is the number. Keeping the next 7 in Europe is the actual work.